Good afternoon. My name is Brian Green, and I'm the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. I would like to welcome you to AI-powered brain implants, novel ethical challenges. This event is part of the IT Ethics and Law Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics and the High Tech Law Institute. Today's panel will highlight the promises and concerns associated with neural implants, addressing the ethical questions posed by the development deployment of brain implants, including those utilizing AI. This intersection of hardware and software, the human body and mind, healthcare, and research raises unique and challenging problems. There will be time for audience questions near the end of our panel today. If you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box for the webinar. Now to our panelists. Dorothy Caminiti is Director of Bioethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Dr. Caminiti's background is in law with a JD from the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium, a Master of Law from the University of Leicester in the UK and University of Liège in Belgium, and a master's degree in bioethics from Harvard Medical School. Matthew Gaudet is Director of Ethics Programs at Santa Clara University School of Engineering. Dr. Gaudet's background is in both engineering and ethics from Villanova, Loyola Marymount University, and with a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Eric Ramirez is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Santa Clara University. Dr. Ramirez's background is in philosophy and psychology from Cal Poly Pomona, with a PhD in philosophy from UC San Diego. Julia Scott is Assistant Professor in Bioengineering and Director of the Brain and Memory Care Lab at Santa Clara University School of Engineering. Dr. Scott's background is in neuroscience from UC Davis and UC San Diego, with a PhD from UC Davis. To start our panel today, I'll direct a question to Dr. Scott. Could you please take 5 minutes to lay out exactly what AI-powered brain implants are, recent technical developments in this area, and what developers are aiming to achieve with such implants?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Green. So I am tasked with the challenge of summarizing this in 5 minutes. So I will do my best so that we have kind of a common set of knowledge to work from. So the focus here really is on invasive brain implants and the AI that makes them possible, that helps to replace or enhance brain function. So just to kind of give a sense of what this means, this isn't just one thing. There are many, many different ways to interface with the central nervous system, including the brain, from putting electrodes directly on the brain to putting the electrodes in the vessels, to putting in different types of stimulation on main nerves and directly in the brain at varying levels of depth. So I'm going to show along the way a few examples of this, but just so we know, we're not talking about one type of technology. The other thing when we talk about AI-powered brain implants is that we're effectively talking about brain-computer interfaces. And when you look at brain-computer interfaces, you're always going to see a diagram like this, where you have sensors, you have a signal, you have this black box, which is the AI, that outputs some message to go do something, whether it's on a computer, a robotic arm, a prosthetic, or so on. So effectively, this brain-computer interface is the foundation for all neural prosthetics. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we're talking about AI in this context of neurotechnology, it is not one type of AI either. There are many different purposes for the AI, as demonstrated here with kind of this summarization as the patterns of AI, but there's also a host of methodologies that range from simple machine learning to more advanced deep learning and transformer models. So the scope of what we're discussing here can begin as something very straightforward to something that is beyond our own comprehension. And this is why we use AI to develop these technologies and restorative functions. So, so one about that. Next slide is a medical procedure, and the medical procedures, the surgeries that are necessary in order to enable brain implants. In one way or another, if we're talking about a brain implant, you need to get access to the brain. The traditional way is through the craniotomy and then actually accessing the brain and central nervous system. So it is highly invasive. The move to reduce that invasiveness is occurring, but this is the physical interface of what we're talking about here. And this aspect also will limit the availability of what we're talking about. So just to highlight a few of these types of interfaces, deep brain stimulation is one that is relatively minimally invasive in that you just need to get thin leads to the target area in order to control their stimulation pattern. So deep brain stimulation has been around quite a long time. It's pre-programmed and it has shown efficacy in Parkinson's and depression. The stentrode is harnessing the technology of the stent, as the name implies, and the sensors are embedded along the stent mesh. So this can be delivered through interventional radiology, and the electrodes become embedded within this vessel wall. And because those vessels are adjacent to brain tissue, as you see here, it picks up the brain activity. So this is a novel way to get to the brain without actually entering the brain. And the company that has spun off from this technology is Synchron. And you'll see that up in the news. They have over 30,000 hours, more than 30,000 patient hours thus far. Sorry, more graphic pictures. So the other thing to keep in mind is that before technologies like this, treatment for things like refractory epilepsy required removal of brain tissue. So we would call this a brain resection. They'd map where the seizure is coming from and literally remove that part of the brain along with the adjacent healthy tissue. So you exchange the stopping of seizures by the loss of brain function. Now we have the option of RNS. RNS is a responsive neurostimulator system that detects through the leads here, detects onset of seizure, runs through a pacemaker-like system that detects it, and then puts a counter signal to prevent that seizure from starting, which will enable people with refractory epilepsy to live a more functional life. When we look at who is using this, who's going to be using the BCI and the AI-powered BCI, it's people like Nathan Copeland. Nathan Copeland suffered a C5 spinal cord injury many years ago, and he has been an advocate of the use of invasive BCI to restore function. Here you see that he is controlling a robotic arm to shake hands with Barack Obama. And he's doing this with the BlackRock Neurotech electrodes. He's also able to feel as they've installed stimulatory electrodes in his brain. And since he has become quite skilled as using these decoding systems, he is able to draw on a digital screen, controlling the mouse to express himself. Right? So quite a wide range of things that can be done with this core technology. What is now pushing the boundaries and really leveraging AI is not just prosthetics for limbs or movement, but prosthetics for speech, prosthetics for how we interface with other people in ways that we haven't been able to do before. And one of the reasons speech is such a difficult thing to reproduce, text we've been able to reproduce, speech really is many layers of things. So the group, this is the most recent version of BrainGate. This involved cooperation from UC Davis, UC Berkeley, and UCSF to get this done. And the similar types of sensors that are in Nathan Copeland's brain are in this patient's brain. And she had a brainstem injury. By looking at 200 data points along her sensory motor cortex, they're able to decode her intended speech, decode the phonemes, decode the sounds, decode the mouth movements, the articulation. So it's really 3 layers of AI that then get expressed in an avatar that is a generative AI of her younger voice before her injury. One of the things to consider with this is that driving this, it is all computing done on site. So when you see the screens and all the computers hidden back here, this is what is required to make this possible. It is not yet at a stage that it can go out into the world and be connected to the internet. In the other direction of where we're going with things being less invasive, epidural, so similar to epidural we think of with anesthesia, this means it is over the lining of the brain, are these 9 by 9 by 11 stimulation cubes. These little cubes developed at Rice University and spun off into Motif Neurotech are wireless, batteryless, and can stimulate at any location around the cortex at specific frequencies. So the goal for this is to make neurostimulation for mental health a more accessible strategy. So while this all sounds absolutely amazing, one thing we need to keep in mind with the development of this technology is that it's extremely hard to get to market. The example here with vision prosthetics, every single vision prosthetic that has come out has failed in the market. And the most recent example is Pixium, which on February 2nd, 2024, so quite recently, after over a decade of development of this retinal implant, an AR solution is being liquidated and being forced to liquidate by the courts. And following the money there, one of the things to consider is who's backing this technology now. And the big shift is that the primary backers in terms of the investment is not coming from governments, it is coming from the tech world. Synchron, BlackRock, Neurotech, Kernel, Neuralink, the primary investors, large percentage of the ownership is concentrated by a few individuals. And so seeing what the goals of the use of this technology is based on who is funding it is something we need to keep in mind. But this all falls into the neuroprosthetics, which is one of the main application focuses of what we'll be talking about in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. For our next question, I'd like to ask the whole panel, what are the ethical implications of such devices? We'll begin with Dr. Scott, and then we'll go to Drs. Caminiti, Ramirez, and Gaudet. So Dr. Scott, if you would proceed.
Well, and they're quite broad, but one of the things we need to keep in mind with the ethical considerations here is the type of information we're extracting from and putting into someone's brain. In a sense, decoding their thoughts and putting in thoughts or feelings. So in maintaining the autonomy and the fidelity of that information throughout the entire process, I think is of key importance as we consider the ethical frameworks to apply. Oh, Brian, you're muted.
My apologies. Dr. Caminiti.
Thank you, Dr. Green, and thank you everyone for having us today. So to your question, Dr. Green, I would like to add to what Dr. Scott just said, that when it comes to the brain, I think we might approach it pretty differently from other technologies so far. And personally, I think that the main concerns are around the changes, the potential changes in identity or personality, and also the questions related to agency and personal responsibility. So as Dr. Scott just explained, there is an interaction between the brain and the machine, here a brain implant, which uses AI, which is very specific, I would say, because it's pretty new compared to other neurotechnologies used in the past. And because of that, and because of this binary, I would say, possible interaction, we could see, some changes in the brain that are conscious or unconscious from the patient perspective, right? And so I would say that maybe a way to analyze it is to take a look at what kind of ethical issues we had with AI and how they were expanded here now that we are using neurotechnology using AI. So there are many ethical issues around AI, as we would all agree. But among the main ones, I would like to cite the lack of transparency, the problems regarding explainability. So the fact that we don't really understand sometimes how AI makes some decisions or, encourage us to make some decisions. Of course, the data biases that we all know, the privacy-related issues, and also the fairness in the way that we don't want AI system to make or recommend decisions that could discriminate against or perpetuate harm across group of people, right? And finally, I would like to mention the accountability ethical issue. Then when we come to neurotechnologies, using AI, we can see that those ethical issues that were initially related to AI per se are still here. And sometimes they are even expanded. So just to cite a couple of them, when it comes to transparency, here, transparency includes the quality of being clear and open about the capabilities of neurotech and the processing of neurodata, and about any interferences that could occur. So here, in my opinion, it's even more important to be transparent about how we process those data and for which purpose, et cetera, right? And so far, we notice some lack of transparency, And also the fairness issue I would like to highlight. So fairness requires an equitable and just treatment of individuals, irrespective, I would say, of their choice to use neurotech or not. And I think it's very important to highlight that, because when people think about fairness and usually social justice, it's more about the fact to have access to those neurotechnologies. But we also need to keep in mind people who are not interested in these neurotechnologies, and therefore who, for a reason or another, will refuse to have, in this case, AI brain implants in the future, when it will become available, not only for disabled people, as we saw with Dr. Scott, but also for healthy people, because in the future, and this is the plan, and I think it will arrive very soon, those devices will be available on the market, right? And so it will open a whole, new context, at least. And so those are the initially ethical issues related to AI, and also, as we saw, as applied to neurotechnologies. But then there are new ethical issues, and I would just like to cite them. And of course, we are going to discuss them all together. But in the new ethical issues that were not really present before, I would like to highlight the concerns about human identity, in the sense that AI has only access to external proxies of identity and not to neurodata. And therefore, it can only indirectly, understand what's going on, while, in these technologies, we could really have a direct access to our thoughts at some point, or, the way our brain functions. So it certainly poses, a question of what does it mean to be human, right? And so the second concern, and the last one, and then of course I will let my my colleagues build on that, is the concerns around mental privacy, as I believe that, as I just said, there is really a possibility for those technologies to influence us, and also to rewrite data on our own brain and system, and therefore, to have direct access to our thoughts and behaviors. And so, as stated by the UNESCO experts, this combination of neurotechnologies and AI poses a threat to mental privacy, simply because, those neurotechnologies have been supercharged with AI algorithms, which can process and learn from data in ways never possible before. And therefore, those experts say that we are on the path to a world in which algorithms will enable us to decode people's mental processes and directly manipulate the brain mechanism underlying their intentions, emotions, and decisions. And with that, I will just let maybe Dr. Ramirez build on that and continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Dorothy and Julia and Brian and Matthew, who has yet to go, but thank you as well. I think that was a really good way of separating out these issues. So I will, I think, cover some of that as well, and maybe expand on one of these like intersecting issues where AI, as you said, Dorothy, AI has got a lot of specific questions that we can raise about it independently of neurological implants. And so I think it's interesting to pause and ask questions about when we talk about the ethics of a neuroimplant. Part of the ethics of a neuroimplant is going to depend on what we're using it for. Bioethicists sometimes make this distinction. It goes by slightly different names in slightly different places. I'm just going to call it the treatment enhancement distinction, right? And the treatment enhancement distinction is essentially a way of asking us to focus on the permissibility of using this particular medical intervention or intervention to do something, right? So as a treatment, we might be using deep brain stimulation as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression, right? And so the technology there is being used. This gets controversial, but it's to restore what we might call normal function in a person. Enhancements are what happen when we take the exact same intervention, but use it not to treat a disorder or a dysfunction, but to give somebody kind of supernormal function of some kind, right? So deep brain stimulation, or possibly the kind of epidural style neural intervention, but now you have control over your mood more generally, not because you have a particular disorder, but because it seems desirable, right, to want to control your mood. In that case, it would be functioning more like an enhancement. And I think both of those have interesting moral dimensions that are worth just flagging and then maybe following up in Q&A. Treatments might seem really uncontroversial, but I think how we cash out, describe, define legally and socially what things need treatment is the subject of a lot of disagreement and debate. Disability rights activists have been fighting this fight for a long time, saying there's a lot of things that get medicalized and say you need to be treated for that maybe are just differences between people, but not necessarily dysfunctions. And it's always worth, in fact, so unplanned prop, right? So always worth keeping on the lookout, right, for how technology might be used to enhance certain ableist projects that we might want to not enhance, right? Though when we talk about enhancement and treatments and AI, I think we also should be cautious about another phenomenon that philosophers of technology just refer to as descaling, right? Descaling is what happens when you use a technology in such a way that it makes it harder to keep a capacity you used to have. Standard examples of descaling are just how bad we are all now at building three-dimensional maps of cities because we all use GPS, right? This used to be a capacity that we housed in here, and now we're really bad at it. We've been deskilled at three-dimensional map production. In some cases, deskilling is totally worth it. We're all, almost all of us are deskilled at whatever tools for survival were necessary in a pre-technological era. We can't survive in that way, and that seems okay. But when we turn some of these, when we turn to AI and neural implants to do things for us that we think are part of what makes us recognizably human, so Dorothy, this speaks to the question you were also speaking about, then I think it's worth pausing and asking moral questions about that. So if we're using it as an enhancement to regulate emotionality or affect, that's a control that people often have never had before. And so do we want people to be able to control their emotions in this way, or their mood if you think emotions are more complicated? If you're turning to AI to help make certain kinds of things more salient to you in a high pressure situation, so you have less anxiety or stress, is that something that we want people to have control over? What sorts of moral capacities will that de-skill us on that we think are important for people to actually develop, right? de-skilling concern right now about social skills, given how much we're all interacting in the way that this forum is interacting, right? And how people are losing social ability that is pretty important to how we interact as human beings. And so those kinds of concerns, I think, should always be in, if not the foreground, in the background when we talk about these sorts of things. And I'll say two more quick things. I mean, the what are we question is really interesting to me, in the sense that there's another kind of short philosophical quip saying that philosophers like to say, which is that ought implies can. And all ought implies can means is that we normally think that people can only be responsible for things that they have control over. If you don't have control over something, it's unfair to hold you responsible for it. And so what these technologies do often, treatments or enhancements, is give us control over something we didn't used to have control over, so that now we are responsible for doing it or not. Sometimes that's great, but it also does create this new burden of responsibility. It reduces some of the social and moral force of arguments for inclusiveness, right? It's especially when it comes to differences in capacity and ability, because now this is just something that you can take control over, and it's your responsibility to do so if you have it, if we now have the technology to do it. And you have a form of depression that you might be diagnosed as, for example, in a way, now it's your fault, it's your responsibility to get treated for it in a way that it didn't used to be. And so I think that kind of concern about, so bioethicist Michael Sandel, he calls it the explosion of responsibility, right? That like sometimes our biotechnologies suddenly make us more responsible for things that we didn't used to be, and therefore gives us less reason to find acceptance in them. I guess as a last point to something you were saying, Dorothy, I think there's a lot of good reasons for thinking that we should care about mental privacy, right? That these technologies really do give us an ability, especially once you train an algorithm on a specific brain, right? Because brains can be slightly, I mean, all brains are slightly different. So to get the text to speech, right? So that Julia was talking about, the sort of BCI training, you need to train it on a specific brain. But if you do that, you really can start to, people are doing some really interesting things, right? Decoding visual cortex information to reconstruct visual imagery, motor cortex to reconstruct speech and things like this. There is this concern that we have now access, non-consensual access to people's inner thoughts, right? This right to mental privacy, I think, is really important. And one possible side effect of thinking that the right to mental privacy is really important is that it applies to things beyond just neurodata. AI is really useful at decoding all sorts of human behavior and giving you access to inner mental thoughts, facial expressions, maybe especially, to reveal what you may be thinking and feeling, even though you may not wish to reveal what you're thinking and feeling, right? Eye tracking data to reveal salience and attention and cognitive load. You can know a lot about a person's brain and mind without actually getting neural data. And so if we care about protecting people's inner mental thoughts from non-consensual intrusion, and it's neurotechnologies that are making us think about this now, then it might be we need to actually protect a lot of other kinds of data that give us similar kinds of things that are not neurodata at all, but behavioral data, right? Video data, audio data that can read the inflections of voice patterns to get emotionality. There's a lot of things that might reveal your inner mental thoughts. And those should probably be protected under a similar kind of right to mental privacy, if we care about mental privacy. So that'll be all I'll say, and then we'll see how the discussion goes.
All right, lots has been said. Wonderful. Almost too much to process. So I think what I'm going to do with my time is try to organize my own thoughts, at least, and hopefully this is helpful for others, in terms of the different sort of categories in which we might be able to think about this. And some of this has already been done. So when I was sort of writing down my notes and thinking about this question in preparation for this panel, I thought there's a whole category of things that are sort of the patient concerns, right? Many of those are transported directly from bioethics and the longstanding medical ethics, standards of rights and things like that. Some of them are new though. So we have old concerns of rights to autonomy, rights to privacy, rights to informed consent. But then we have more specific concerns that are already been mentioned. Some of them: rights to cognitive liberty, rights to mental privacy, rights to interactive agency, right, which are new using this technology, or at least subsets of those other rights. Rights only take us so far though. Rights are very good and very important framework, but they by their nature only set a minimum for us. They tell us what we shouldn't do, essentially. And they don't do a very good job of telling us what we should do. On that same level though, there's a second sort of set of questions that I began to ask. I began to ask questions about vulnerabilities. Questions of how these systems can be hacked, how they can be weaponized, what evildoers might do if they got a hold of them, and how they might get a hold of them, or what our society and the evils and the injustices that already exist in our society, biases, disinformation, things that already exist in our society, how those might be able to use this technology to advance things that are problematic that already exist within us. I also briefly, went to philosopher Robert Nozick's experience machine, right? Which was a thought experiment back in, what was it, the 80s, 70s? I think he wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia in the 70s. But it was a response to hedonism. It was a response to the idea that all we need to do in life is be happy, right? And he argued that if that's the case, then all we need to do is hook ourselves up to an experience machine that just gives us constant happiness. Well, that was in a thought experiment in the 70s. This technology actually makes it realistic that we could possibly do this. And is this something we want to do? Which gets to a concern that both Eric and Dorothy, actually all three panelists, have already said so far, right? Which is, what does it mean to be truly human? And is happiness enough? Or is that sort of that image of happiness, that stimulation of happiness, the same as what it means to be truly human? I think we need to hold on to that sort of human question. And then I think the part that has been sort of alluded to, but I this is where my thought always goes, because it's what I am primarily a social ethicist. So I go to the social questions of how this is going to affect society, and some of this has been raised already. The question of once this becomes not just treatment but enhancement, right? What does that do to those who don't get enhanced, and how does that change our expectations, and things like that? So much of that's already been said. I also worry about that. Oftentimes when we bring out new technologies, the promise of the technology seems really, really good, but we're not often seeing the side effects. We're not often seeing the way in which it's not going to fulfill on that promise. And just by way of analogy, I would raise up social media. Social media promised to connect us. It did it. It connected us. I'm connected to high school friends that I never would be connected with before this, but it did it on such a superficial and sort of vapid level that, like, it's not really helpful in many cases, right? I can have 500 friends and not actually be connected in any meaningful way to any of them. And I worry that if we're trying to recreate using brain stimuli, physical and human experiences, are we going to do it on a level that is not as substantial, and therefore is there a cost to that? And so that's one of the things that I began to think that I don't have an answer to that, but I do worry about these things. Again, trying to sort of organize my thoughts here. As the other panelists were talking, Eric talked about, and I already mentioned, treatment versus enhancement. I would also go to, so that's a standard sort of framework for bioethics or medical ethics. I would go to a what's become for me a very standard framework for thinking about any sort of AI ethics, is Norian Herzfeld's distinction between, is the AI going to be a tool for us? Is it going to be a partner with us? Or is it going to be a surrogate for us, right? And I have to ask that question along in here. What is this technology going to do? I hope it's a tool that helps us to be more fully ourselves, right? But is it going to, in some ways, become a surrogate, make the thoughts for us instead of actually processing the thoughts that we already have? At what point does it cross that line? That's another distinction I think we need to make. And then the other category in which I've worked in the past is the distinction, or I've worked in disability ethics, and this obviously has a lot to do with disability and how we how we try to respond to what we call disabilities. And in that category, I would distinguish between, not just me, but in the disability rights community, there's a distinction between the impairment and the disability, which is slightly different than treatment versus enhancement. But it's the distinction between the impairment is the actual condition, a deaf person who cannot hear, versus the disability is how that impairment is then affected by the social structures and the things that we have around us. A person who cannot hear has trouble with crosswalks, right? Can't hear the cars coming, and so therefore needs assistance with that. A person who cannot see needs the oral stimulus of the chirps and the tactile stimulus of the little yellow bumps, right? When you come up to a crosswalk, needs the braille on the ATM because they can't see the number pad, right? That's not a problem of the impairment. That is a problem of the way we've structured our society to expect that we don't have such impairments. And so whenever we try to solve, quote unquote, solve for an impairment, I also just want to raise up the question of, are we trying to solve for an impairment in a way that is treating the impairment, or are we actually trying to treat the disability in a are we trying to treat the disability in a way that is sort of absolving ourselves from the social problems that we've created through the way we've structured our society, right? And I think back to prior sort of approaches to this. Prior approaches to disability, we've had significant problems, right? Where we have done things like lobotomies, where we have done things like institutionalization. Those were solutions, right, to some of the problems of disability, but not solutions that protected the rights of the person themselves. It just removed them from society, so that society no longer needed to see those people anymore, right? So society no longer needed to deal with those people, and society could function perfectly fine so long as we remove them, and so I'm not suggesting that that's what's happening here, but I do want to make sure that the patient remains at the center of this, right? And the person who is being who is gaining abilities through this technology, and is able to use these tools, and I hope it remains as tools, not surrogates, right? Is able to gain abilities that helps them in a way that isn't just helping society at large deal with them, right? And I think that's the final distinction that I want to make and sort of raise up. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of you so far. This has been fantastic, and we're already to 12:40, so we have 20 minutes left, so we'll have to try to go quickly through the last few questions. There are a couple questions coming in the Q&A, which is fantastic. If there are audience members, if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A, and we will get to those when we can. For now, I want to ask the next question, which is about, and actually I think I'll compress together questions 3 and 4. What are the best futures that you see for this technology? What path are we on right now? What do you think will be a likely outcome? And then, as well as question 4, what are some things that potential users or regulators should be thinking about with this technology? What legal approach might we take in order to get on a path towards a better future and avoiding one of the worst futures? And to anyone. Julia.
Yeah. So listening to everyone here, it's to the extremes of where things can go wrong. But when we're thinking about the best futures, and kind of the ethical implications in terms of our responsibility to do something about the extremely high cost of illness for neurological disorders. Neurological disorders are the #1 cause of disability. Like, however we define the word, having functionality lower than where you started and not having the ability to work and support yourself, and having options beyond pharmaceutical options, beyond care and dependency, is the promise of technologies in this range. To do so responsibly requires protections be put in place first in the research and development, so that they come to market being safe and efficacious. And when we look at the companies that are leading in this, BlackRock Neurotech has been at this for a long time. their Utah rays and so on have been shown to be very safe. And so, but it takes a long time. Trying to jump the line in that process is where I get more concerned. And if we look at examples of groups trying to jump the line, we can look at the progress with the link, with the Neuralink, which is advancing robotic surgery. It's advancing the number of contacts to the thousands within the brain in a way that has not been shown to be reversible. And there's approval to do the human subjects testing. It has started in Arizona, but it is not being registered as a clinical trial, which means the data is not open, the procedures are not transparent. So I think at the regulatory level, the enforcement of the medical norms to any type of medical device needs to be applied with another layer of requirements when it comes to the cybersecurity around the data and how that data can be used. Because effectively, when we look at that speech prosthetic, those scientists and doctors have developed a model, many layers of models of how that person thinks and expresses themselves, which is enabling her to communicate with her family, which is a gift, but it is also something that needs to be protected at the utmost level. So I think in some senses, new regulations, new rules to how we manage that data, but also simply enforcement of the rules we have in place. And if neurotech moves out of the medical sphere, this type of invasive neurotech, those guardrails are much, much softer. So, yeah, those are where my concerns really lie.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Dr. Caminiti.
So there is one concern that has not been discussed yet, and I would like just to briefly mention it for the sake of time. It's the unwanted device explantation. Because we talked about, you know, the risks for the surgery when we implant the device, but not when for a reason or another. And one of those reasons was mentioned earlier by Dr. Scott, if the company goes bankrupt, we need to explant that device just for safety reasons, because there is no update possible, there is no follow-up possible. So even if people who wanted those devices and experienced those devices very positively, for instance, the case I have in mind is a case about who we called patient R, and this patient was using a brain-computer interface in order to mitigate their risk of epileptic seizures. And basically, the device was working perfectly. And this patient had really a higher quality of life thanks to that device. But 2 years after the implantation, the company, which was back then Neurovista, went bankrupt. And basically, they had to explant that device. And the concerning part is not only that the patient goes back to the previous state she was in, with all the harm and psychological effect that can have, but what was concerning to me reading that case, which is beautifully explained by a few experts in the field, Jean-Christophe Bulbis, Frédéric Gilbert, and also Marcello Janca, who is one of my ex-colleagues from ETH Zurich, and who is now in Munich. They explain how, you know, this patient felt she was connected to the device to the point that the device became a part of herself. And so when we had to remove that device, basically the patient experienced a trauma, if you will, just because, you know, it was as if a part of herself, her natural body, if I can call it like that, disappeared. And I think, you know, this is concerning because there is a lot from the psychological standpoint as well to take into account, and a lot about the risk of harm, you know, for the mental health of the person. And so I think, you know, in a nutshell, that this must be highlighted. Those devices, as Dr. Scott and many others said, are truly amazing for many, many patients. But one of our main responsibilities as a society is to ensure that we protect those patients after, you know, if anything goes wrong. let's say the company goes bankrupt, or let's say there is a problem. So I think in the laws, one of the questions we should ask ourselves is who is accountable if anything goes wrong, and what do we do to protect and to care for those people who are going to use those devices for medical reasons or beyond.
Thank you. Over to Dr. Ramirez.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief for time. So worst case scenario, no regulation at all, right? That's obviously the worst case scenario. You should not trust corporate interests to have your interests in mind when they develop this technology. None of us should. I think the real challenge is finding the right framework to enshrine both something like a right to mental privacy, and that has to get explicated, but also as Dr. Gaudet said, rights are kind of they set a floor, right, not a ceiling. And so there's got to be a lot of social and moral and political changes that happen in addition to enshrining these rights to get us to take more seriously what it is to care about mental privacy, right? So people, I think, should have a right to their neurological data, right? They should be the ones who are empowered to control it. But transparency and consent only go so far, right? I unlike some of my panelists, I am not a lawyer. So when I read certain kinds of agreements that I'm signing up to, when I agree to things, like I may seem like I have consent over it, but I don't. So I think helping to translate what it is that this information is, what it can be used for, what its limits are, right? Not all neural data is the same either. EEG is very different from fMRI, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So what this data can be used for, what it can reveal about us intentionally or not, is important for people to know, just so they are empowered to make decisions about how this data gets released or used. And yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge, is finding the right framework. I think treating it all as medical data is probably not the best framework, but it would certainly get you a kind of set of rights and protections if you did. And I think that's some things that people are struggling with right now as they come to terms with protecting while not stifling the development of the technology.
Thank you. Dr. Gaudet, you had unmuted earlier. Was there something that you wanted to say?
I was gonna say something similar to what Eric just said about rights being sort of, because you're to frame your question, to reframe your question in terms of the best possible scenario and the worst possible scenario. Eric's right that the worst possible scenario is no regulation whatsoever. But I don't foresee that happening. But I think if we leave just rights, that is also a worst case scenario. And I do think we need to have larger social conversations as a broader society about what our technological future should look like. We're not doing enough to talk about that. And we're not doing enough to become technologically literate about what technologies are out there. But also within the corporate culture, if you want to talk about best case scenario, I think there is something to be said for the necessity of corporate cultures. And Julia sent us a great article on this. I wonder if we can link to it as we prepared for this, on the culture of responsible neurotech, right? And the corporate culture informing what gets built and how it gets built, and what limits we put on how we build, and what priorities we put on how we build, and the importance of building the proper culture so that we're asking the right questions. If we're not doing that, then when we build collectively in a corporate environment, then the only thing that we're all going to collectively agree on is we want to make profit on this, right? But if along the way we also want to solve some certain problems and do it in a particular way, then we need to have conversations around that, which is why we need ethicists in the conversation, philosophers in the conversation, humanists in the conversation. What does it mean to live a fully human life, right? And therefore, when we design, how are we actually building towards that? That has to happen in our schools, which I know you have a question later on, Brian, about whether or not we get to it or not, about how we educate towards that. But it also has to happen in our corporations. And I think there are corporations who model this well, and there's corporations who don't. And I think we should be funding and advancing and helping those who model it well.
Thank you. Over to Dr. Kemenidi quickly, and then we'll take an audience question.
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to mention the surveillance, risk that are really concerning to me as well, because we know that certain societies already right now are really monitoring their citizens, let's say workers or even children at school. And I've particularly in mind China. We know that in certain areas in China, it's already happening thanks to BCIs. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. And I would like to add that, of course, there is the hacking issue. I think it has already mentioned, but once you have a device like this in your brain, it's very easy, for hackers to just manipulate you and change your thoughts or your decisions. And so this is the worst case scenario to me. And to your question about what should be done, I agree with all the panelists so far. And I would like to add that we need some kind of collaboration, not only at a national level, but also at an international level. And to those 2 points, I would like to briefly mention the fact that Colorado has enacted the first US law aimed at protecting individuals' brainwave data as sensitive information under its data privacy law, the Colorado Privacy Act. So it's a milestone for the US to have such a law enacted, and I think it will really help the field. I also would like to mention the international efforts done so far, and especially the one done by UNESCO. As you might have read, we have 24 fantastic experts, some of which I know personally, who are part of this new group dealing with neuroethics issues. And basically, the plan is to have several meetings. So they are going to have several meetings, and they will also, as far as I understood, include some public discussions and take them into account in order to draft some guideline or framework in this field. So I think it's very worth it to follow them and see what they can come with to help our society.
Thank you. And I will just add one point, which is that when you talk to developers of the technology, their worst case scenario is that the technology doesn't work. And then we'll get none of the benefits from it. We'll get none of the risks, but then we'll actually get none of the benefits. And there are lots of people who need these sorts of devices that'll hopefully be able to give them those benefits. All right, over to some audience questions now. So, and I'll just read this one off. It's from an anonymous attendee. Some of the ethical concerns seem more hypothetical than the benefits that can be garnered by people who, for example, no longer have to have their brains dissected right now. How should we balance the time frame of the benefits and the harms here? Any thoughts? Eric.
I guess I'll just briefly say, so Julie, I saw you unmuted, so I'll be very brief. I think we should try to be preventative with our risks, right? I mean, the point of being hypothetical is to try and prevent it's better to prevent something from happening than to have to deal with it afterward. And so to the degree that we can predict certain possible avenues, either for bad outcomes or bad behaviors with these technologies, we should build those in from the ground up, try to preventative measures. But absolutely, I do think this technology has, at the level of treatment, a lot of promise, a lot, and we shouldn't stifle that element of it because we're trying to prevent us becoming a hive mind because these things are linking us all together or something really hypothetical like that. So absolutely, it's not a real answer to that question because the question is how do we balance? But I do think the preventative nature of harm and risk management is important to keep in mind. Better for it not to happen.
Right. Now, Julia, did you want to go next? Okay.
And I'll echo that about, writing the rules with that anticipation of what could occur. When we write the rules based on the present technology, it's going to be correction and litigation like afterwards. But when the principles to follow are clear, when within a government system we can agree upon that, on where the boundaries should be, then we can provide that guidance. And whether we're in enough agreement across the US to develop regulations yet, I think is still is open-ended, but it needs to converge quick because the technology is moving pretty fast and it will only move faster. So.
Thank you. Matt, did you have one?
Yeah, I want to build on what you said at the end of the last question before we turn to the questions here, before we turn to the audience questions. And in response to this, I do think that I agree with the general sort of positive, like I don't want to be a Luddite here, and I don't want to be anti-technology, but at the same time, we also have to be cautious of deferring to the inevitability of technology, right? That this is absolutely going to happen, and therefore all the good things are going to happen. So if we wait, think of all the people who could have been helped in the meantime. That takes a certain amount of presumption that it's going to happen. It's going to happen in the way we think it's going to happen, right? That isn't necessarily true. And so I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to this question about whether or not, about how to balance these two things. But I do think it takes good judgment, and I think it takes good conversation. I think it takes being cognizant of both the pluses and the minuses that are coming from our technology.
And just to add something to that, I totally agree with what was just said. It's also a question of case-by-case assessment, I would say, because of course, someone who is healthy maybe lives perfectly or, without that device cannot be compared to someone with Parkinson's disease who cannot, live correctly because he cannot even walk or, take a cup of coffee. So I think that, the initial context of the person who is planning to get the device implanted matters a lot to me. And the balance, risk and benefits must be a case-by-case one.
Yeah, and your use of case-by-case there reminded me of something that I also thought about as I prepared for this, which is the importance of, and I think it actually gets to the answer here of like, what method should we use and how should we approach this? I do think there's been success in medical ethics of the use of casuistry, which is case-based ethics, comparing known cases against unknown cases. We can't get into the details of what all counts as good casuistry and bad casuistry here, but I do think there are philosophical methodologies that have proven successful at helping us to navigate novel ethical technological situations. That is more than just anti-technology or pro-technology, but instead helps us to unpack the nuances of each specific case by case, like you said, Dorothy.
Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much to our audience. Thank you to the organizers at the Markkula Center. Thank you to our co-sponsors at the High Tech Law Institute. And thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green.
Thank you very much, everyone.